to Philosophy 3400 Ethics. Today we're looking at the first half or so of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6. We'll begin on page 102, right at the beginning here, chapter 1, 1138b, line 19 or so. So what is the problem that Aristotle starts with here? And that's that a formal understanding of virtue, right, is one thing, but if we don't make it concrete, that is, if we understand virtue in a formal sense, but don't actually have the substance of it, we're not really in the best position. And that is what he takes himself to have done so far, is he's really giving you a formal understanding of virtue, but we need more concreteness. So let's look at this. Since what we said earlier is that one ought to choose the mean and not the excess or the deficiency, and the mean is, as right reason says, in other words, you can find what he calls a phronimos, a wise person who already displays a virtue. That person, will be a sort of guide. Let us explicate this. In all the active conditions of the soul described, as also with all the others, all the other souls described are active conditions, Aristotle, there is some target to which the one who has a rational understanding looks off as he tightens or loosens his grip. Right? We're trying to hit a target. There is some boundary marking the mean conditions which we claim are between an excess and a deficiency. And if you hit the target, right, you hit the target. If you go on the other side of these boundary markings, you have missed. And this boundary is established by, as he puts it, right reason. While speaking this way is truthful, there is nothing clear in it. For in all, and I'm reminded of Adorno's point, right? You're looking for practical advice? Sorry, kid, I don't have it. Right? Speaking this way is truthful, but there's nothing clear in it. For in all other pursuits about which there is knowledge, it is true to say this, that one ought not to bear down or let up too much or too little, but the mean amounts, and according to the right reason. In other words, this is good general advice for anything, right? Even a sort of productive, you're at work and you're making something. He says this is good advice for people making stuff at work too, not just for all of us living our lives here, trying to do the right things in general. In other words, we're giving really good general formal advice. We're not actually filling that out with the substance that would really help people do the right thing. Having this understanding alone, right, this formal understanding, virtue is a mean between extremes. Having this understanding alone, one would know nothing more, as if someone were to say that one ought to apply to the body whatever the medical art calls for, and in the way the one who has it says, right? In other words, how do you treat this illness? Well, it's whatever the art of medicine would call for in this case. And if you have any questions, go see a professional doctor and they'll tell you, right? The idea is, thanks, you're not wrong, right? That I'll need some kind of treatment that is called for in medicine, and that I'll need to, follow some kind of regimen according to what a trained medical professional tells me. That's right, but like what I'm looking for is, what is the treatment? I need the medicine now, right? And how do I take it? And what's the dosage and whatnot? Hence it is necessary, Aristotle reasons, in connection with the active conditions of the soul as well, not only that this be said truly, but that it also be determined what the right understanding is and what defines this. So, how are we going to do this? Aristotle is now going to distinguish parts of the soul. If you look further down on page 102 at 1139a, line 3 or 4 or so, it was said before that there are two parts of the soul, the part that has reason and the irrational part. But now one must make a division in the same way concerning the part that has reason. So it turns out not only can we split the soul into a reason part, a reasonable part, a rational part, and an irrational part. Furthermore, within the subdivision of the rational part, there's an additional division, right? So one must make a division in the same way concerning the part that has reason. We have to split reason, the rational part of the soul, into two parts now. Let two parts that have reason be assumed. One part by which we contemplate the sorts of beings of which the governing principles are incapable of being other than they are. One part by which we contemplate that which is insofar as it has to sort of be. And here he's thinking of, so what beings have governing principles and capable of being other than they are? This is going to be contemplation of intellectual matters, and of nature, and of sort of the first principles, maybe we might say, of nature, the most basic principles. Now, and so it's going to govern, for instance, the knowledge we have of the universe, of the laws, as we would put it today, the laws of science, and etc. Whereas we distinguish that then from the other rational part of the soul, by which we contemplate things that are capable of being otherwise. This will include the entire realm of human practical activity and productive activity. So on the one hand, there's a kind of rational part of the soul that's concerned with understanding the truth about the way the world is and what things are in themselves as part of that world, without worrying about how things might be different. So here I would think of pure science, pure physics, and cosmology, and astronomy, and whatnot, right? We just want to understand the universe and where we fit into it. And we're just trying to understand how things are. Gravity, right? For example, what is gravity? Electromagnetism and whatnot. What are these forces in the universe? What are the laws that must obtain, right? Matter may not be created nor destroyed, right? E equals mc squared, and whatnot. Now there's another part of the rational part of the soul. There's another division of the rational part of the soul here, where we contemplate things that are capable of being otherwise. Here you can think of applied science. We take everything that is done in theoretical science, we try to find applications for it. Now we want to figure out how things can be made otherwise, right? There's something like gravity. How do we counteract gravity? How do we create a situation where people do not have to obey the laws of gravity? How do we create flight, for example? How do we make things fly in the air, including ourselves? Despite the fact that gravity would like to prevent that, so to speak. But also, I think it's more clear to understand this rational part of our soul that deals with and contemplates things capable of being otherwise. It's much clearer when we think about understanding human productive activity and practical activity for Aristotle. Are we making stuff, and are we doing stuff with each other in our communities? And when we are doing stuff with each other in our communities, or when we are making stuff together with others or by ourselves, in both cases, the rational part of our soul that contemplates things capable of being otherwise is at stake and at work there. Okay? So, we have a certain culture, we have traditions, we have laws, we have rules, customs, and conventions, and whatnot, and in all of that, and we are also doing things and making things together, producing things. What we're doing there could be done otherwise, right? You can travel around the world, see that people have different customs. They prepare their meals differently. They bury their dead differently. They make the same things, chairs, beds, houses, and they do it differently, right? In significantly different ways. Thus you learn, right? All these cultural matters, all of these matters of economy are capable of being otherwise, right? There is no sort of invariable law for all human beings. These things must always obtain. All right, so he's divided the soul then, the rational part of the soul, into these two different categories, and he's going to then conclude that one must grasp the best active condition of each of these parts, since that will be the virtue of each. So what is going to be the virtue then of this part, the rational part of our soul that contemplates the things that are insofar as they are? It tries to understand things on their own terms, and it's just simply trying to understand what is necessarily true, as opposed to understanding the things that are not necessarily true, things capable of being otherwise. And so there's going to be a different best active condition. There are going to be different virtues here. He's going to distinguish these virtues, by this category. And it's going to turn out that the category that has to do with contemplating the sorts of beings of which the governing principles are incapable of being other than they are, that's going to be theoretical virtue. That's going to be the intellectual virtues as they come to be known here, intellectual virtues, whereas the rational part of the soul that contemplates and more than just contemplates, but sometimes is at work in some activity here. I mean, contemplation itself is an activity, but the idea is here you're doing more than just trying to understand something. You're also, it's a practical kind of understanding. We need to make something, or I need to do something, a good or a service. I must produce a good, must perform a service, and this good, this good could be produced in a different way potentially. This service could be provided in a different manner, and that's going to be a different kind of mental virtue, right? But it's going to be so you're going to have sort of something like productive activity where people make stuff. There's going to be the virtues involved in making those things, right? When we make them well here in Athens, we make ships and boats very well or something, but others elsewhere make them differently. Okay, so these are going to be different kinds of virtues. And of course, the best virtues for Aristotle will be the theoretical, the intellectual ones that have nothing to do with making stuff or doing stuff. Insofar as you have to make things, insofar as you have to do things, for Aristotle, that's a constraint that limits you in a way that you are not limited when you are simply contemplating nature and eternity and sort of laws that govern the reality we live in. Whereas people that have to make things are going to be limited by, technology, the state of technology at the time, by the demand for the goods they are making, by a whole variety of things, and by the repetition of the production process. Okay, so if we move to chapter 2 then, on page 103, right around 1139a 20, maybe 17 or so. There are three things in the soul, Aristotle claims, that govern action and truth: sense perception, intellect, and desire. And so let's think here, right? Action and truth. Let's take as an example, right? Take as an example, one of my favorite examples, drawn from Aristotle, right? Let's take a chicken. And so when you think about a chicken, right? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, right? But the idea is, let's think about how intellect is involved here. And as Aristotle puts it, this is an example drawn from Aristotle himself elsewhere, right? Our intellect tells us that eating chicken is good for our health because it provides protein. I mean, Aristotle didn't put it exactly that way, but they understood eating this bird was it was the kind of food that was good for a person, so they thought. So our intellect can tell us that, right? Now, desire. Desire is feeling hungry, right? So my intellect tells me that eating chicken is good for my health. Protein is good for me. My desire, though, is separate from that, right? My intellect can tell me that eating chicken is great, healthy, whatever. But if I'm not hungry, I'm not really going to be motivated to do much about that, and it doesn't really matter, right? But if I'm hungry, and my intellect is telling me that eating chicken is good, right? And furthermore, if I have the sense perception that, I just drove by Popeye's Chicken, which just opened in town, and they sell chicken there. Now I have my intellect telling me that to eat chicken is good for my health because protein. I have the desire, I'm hungry, my stomach is rumbling, and I have the sense perception. I just drove by a Popeye's Chicken, or whatever, a KFC, or whoever. Popeye's though in my case. And now now not only am I thinking that to eat chicken is good for one's health and to obtain that protein is good, I am hungry, but now there is chicken right there, and all I have to do is go and obtain it. So you need all three of these things to govern action and truth. You need the sense perception, you need the intellect working, and you need desire to all be sort of coming together. Okay. But of course the most important thing here, right, is going to be intellect. You must understand first, right, what it is. That is true, then impelled by a desire, your perception must also be accurate, something to that effect. So the source of action, as he puts it, is choice, and you make a choice, right? Okay, eating chicken is good, I'm hungry, there's a Popeyes, I'm going, turning around, heading into the drive-thru, or whatever the case might be. The source of action then is choice, the origin of motion, rather than the cause for the sake of which it takes place. In other words, we're thinking here of choice as something that sets us in motion towards something that we are after. Well, and so what is the source of choice then, right? So choice is a kind of source of our action, but what is the source of the choice? Desire combined with a rational understanding for the sake of something, right? For the sake of health. Why am I hungry? I'm hungry for the sake of my health. But that alone is not good enough, right? There are things out there that are bad for my health, things out there that are good for my health, things out there that are not food at all. Therefore, I must, use my understanding. I must identify what these candidates are, and then I must use my senses, right? Even if I know what is good for me to eat, it's not going to do me much good if I don't have a way of actually finding it with my senses and verifying that it is in fact what I'm after. All right, let's keep moving through here to chapter 3 maybe. We're going to start all over again, he says, starting anew from a higher standpoint. Let's come back to these different parts of the soul. Let these powers, those powers with which the soul discloses truth by affirming and denying, you get a note here. Let these powers be 5 in number. These are art, knowledge, practical judgment, wisdom, and intellect. Okay, so this is how our soul discloses truth by affirming what is true, by denying what is false. And here are these powers: art, knowledge, practical judgment, wisdom, intellect. Try to understand these powers better. All right, starting then with knowledge. He says, what knowledge is will be evident, and this is right at the beginning of chapter 3, 1139b, around line 15 or so, 16, 17. What knowledge is will be evident from the following, if one is to speak precisely and not go by things that resemble it. There's a lot of pseudo-knowledge out there, especially today. And so yes, it's not always easy to distinguish actual knowledge from spurious knowledge. What knowledge is will be evident from the following. We all assume that what we know is not capable of being otherwise. 2 plus 2, just an example, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. Unless you're in George Orwell's 1984 and somebody is torturing you, forcing you to say that 2 plus 2 equals 5, and even then, right, you're only saying that under duress and because you're being tortured. But the idea is no matter what time it is, no matter what year it is, no matter whether you're in Mumbai, India, Mexico City, or right here in Turlock, right, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Right? Knowledge cannot be otherwise in this sense. But with things, Aristotle says, that are capable of being otherwise, whenever they occur outside our view, it escapes our notice whether they are or not. Right? That maybe they are, maybe they aren't that way. With things that can be otherwise. Therefore, and so we'll come to some examples of this. But for instance, things that are capable of being otherwise. We don't sit there and worry. What are they? Right? They are irrelevant, frankly, unless we have some reason to pay attention. Therefore, a thing that is known is by necessity. When you know something, he thinks you understand the necessary rules that sort of make something true. And therefore it is everlasting, right? 2 plus 2 was 4 in Aristotle's time. 2 plus 2 is 4 today. It's a very simple example, but it works. Therefore it is everlasting, since all things that are, simply by necessity, are everlasting. As long as we continue to have the mathematics that we continue to use in the basic arithmetic, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. So I can think of an example, I try to, right? I try to think of a counterexample. Can I think of an example where 2 plus 2 is not 4? And the only example I can even come up with is something like you can have a dream in which it might appear that what you thought you knew, that 2 plus 2 is 4, is somehow not true. But the issue is, as you wake up, you try to formulate this, you try to articulate it. If you becomes clear that whatever the heck was going on in that dream state doesn't really correspond to how the world seems to work when we're awake, and how our minds have to work in order to understand what is happening around us. So in other words, there can be situations where what we took to be necessarily true seems somehow maybe questionable, and yet when further analysis might reveal there's something going on with our psychology there's something going on with our brain chemistry, etc. So, something that is known is by necessity, it's everlasting. All things that are simply by necessity are everlasting. And everlasting things are ungenerated and indestructible. In other words, like the laws of physics or something like this, according to Aristotle, right, is what's simply by necessity. And so in that sense, it's not that the things that obey the laws of nature are ungenerated and indestructible. It's just these principles and our knowledge of it. So our knowledge, for instance, of how gravity works, right, is another thing, right, that is supposedly, right, everlasting. Okay. He says also all knowledge seems to be teachable and what is known as learnable. But all teaching comes from things that are already discerned. As we also say in the writings on logic, since teaching takes place either by means of examples or by deductive reasoning. And so, right, knowledge is teachable, what is known as learnable, but everything that involves teaching involves things that are already known, right? And that's another clue for Aristotle that these things are everlasting. There's nothing new, maybe, that you can learn that hasn't already been known, something like that. To me, there's a lot here that it's questionable, right? I mean, I do think it's possible in any classroom, including this one, for something novel to occur. I'd like to believe that. Some new piece of learning, some new insight could happen. Anyways, looking at his conclusion, he says, therefore, knowledge is an active condition of the soul that governs demonstration. But there's many other additional distinctions as we made in the logical writings. So here, knowledge is going to be the active condition that allows us to logically demonstrate, and in syllogisms and in chains of reasoning involving self-evident premises, involving self-evident assumptions involving premises that are linked in certain ways that necessarily produce a conclusion. This is knowledge, right? So a person with knowledge then can give you this kind of account, right? They don't just know the truth, they can clearly articulate why something is true to you with reasoning. All right, so that's, I think, what he's getting at here is that knowledge necessarily involves the ability to demonstrate one's learning in ways that others then can understand. Right? So you could, for instance, have art. He's going to go on to talk about this in chapter 4. Here, you don't necessarily, one thing I think that's interesting here, and let's see what Aristotle has to say about art. So let's look at this, right? Because it's clearly the case that when it comes to arts in general, and techniques, that people can have the ability to make or do something without necessarily also having the ability to demonstrate it clearly to others in words, right? This is why many people who are good at something are incapable of actually producing children who are good at the same things, right? Despite their ability to do something well, they literally cannot teach their own children to do the same thing well at the same level they do. And so therefore you can have having the ability to produce something reliably and well is not the same thing as having knowledge, is what Aristotle would claim here. So in chapter 4, among things that are capable of being otherwise, there is something that is made, also something that is done, right? You're either making something or you're doing something. Goods and services is what we think of it today often. But making and action are different. I mean, yes and no, right? Making is an action, but he's distinguishing, right, making and doing, right? Do you make things at work, or do you do things as your work? So the active condition involving reason that governs action is also different from the active condition involving reason that governs making. So strictly speaking, this is the difference between practical and productive reason for Aristotle, and the corresponding virtues will be different, right? Things that make you an excellent maker of things are not the same things that make you an excellent doer of things, right? You can be a wonderful brick mason but not a good dancer. Dancing is something you do with your body, and it results in no product distinct from the activity. Whereas building a house is something you do, but it does result in something different from the activity itself, namely the house that is built at the end of the process and is distinct from the builders and all the materials they started with. So all art, as he puts it, right, involves a process of coming into being and to practice an art, and this is at 1140a, right around 1140, 810, 11. All art is concerned with the process of coming into being. To practice an art is also to consider how something capable of being or not being, right? That house could exist or might not exist, right? Houses don't grow on trees, they don't spring out of the ground. That house could exist or it might not exist. It's up to us. Do we want it to exist? Are we going to make it this way, that way, the other way, what materials, etc.? So to practice an art is to consider how something capable of being or not being, and of which the source is in the one who makes it and not in the thing that is made, right? We masons, we electricians, we carpenters, we have to make this. So let's figure out how we're going to do it, right? Art is not concerned with things that either are or come into being by necessity. Again, houses don't come into being by necessity. We must build them. Or with things that are by nature. And houses don't come into being naturally, though you can do things like, inhabit cliff dwellings and caves. You can find natural shelter in various ways and use what nature has provided. Nonetheless, right, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a sort of a natural home, a home that has literally been entirely generated by nature. Good luck with that, with running water and nice bathrooms and everything else. Okay, so with things that are by nature, those things that are by nature have their source in themselves. And again, with the things that are not by nature, the things that are produced by human art, these things do not have their sources in themselves, right? The stones that are used to make a wall for a house, right? Their nature is not to come together into that wall. Believe me, I used to have to carry the bricks and the cinder blocks to the masons, and it was heavy and hard work, precisely because those blocks and those bricks don't just fly up there magically and lock together, right? It takes a lot of human labor, it takes human knowledge as well of how to do that, so that the things you build and make stay there and are effective. Okay, I think that we are just about where we need to be for today. So you know what, I'm going to let that suffice. I've certainly gone on long enough to at least, sort of get us started here on Book 6 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and we'll have more to say in the second part of the video lecture. So until then, take care.